Sap, Vach. Anons, who like to climb abandoned places, did you have any scary and creepy moments during your activity? Share them here. We don't force the grandfathers, we attach photos of the place, discuss, get scared. I'm reposting a story here. I'm making my own IRL story from the beginning. It was 2005. There were a lot of abandoned sanatoriums in my city, including some that were quite old, from the time of the Tsar father. We chose one of them because we were shitheads, punk metal heads. And in general, we were young and perky romantics. We liked to drink beer and cheap port in unusual places for that matter, like cemeteries, country wastelands, and abandoned buildings. And so we had post-New Year holidays, a great student time when we could devote a whole month to ourselves. So we sipped beer, sitting in or near the abandoned building and telling scary stories and other heartfelt stories. And then my friend says, you know, it seems like our building is being renovated. A week or two ago I was leaving the Sheriga and decided to drop in here to relieve myself. I was walking down the corridor and there in an empty room someone was sitting on their knees, apparently fixing an outlet. Then he doubted it. Well, maybe it was a person, or maybe just a pile of junk left over from a homeless person, like he got scared, when you are alone in a room where you don't expect to meet anyone, and then, bam, and someone invades your personal space. It's already kind of uneasy. And I, having already plucked up my courage, said, let's go look at your pile of junk. And we went to look in the dark. It was already 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. dark. Cold, a week after Christmas. The walls are all covered in ice and frost, icicles hang from the ceiling. Instead of flashlights, primitive phones. So we enter this empty building, walk along the corridors. We find that room. I threw a candle there, and there was a guy, just like my friend said, sitting on his knees and not moving. He was dressed all in black, like a security guard or that fucking military guy who likes to wear security and military gear. I noticed that he was wearing good boots, combat boots. They were well preserved due to the frost, they didn't even stink. I felt uneasy, like we were in an empty building next to a corpse. What if they pin all the blame on us? So we retreated. Through friends and acquaintances, we reported the corpse to the police. And 2 days later we witnessed how the servicemen very carelessly dragged this corpse out of the building in a bag and loaded it into a corpse truck. In short, out of curiosity, we visited that room as soon as the cops had run away. And there were several candle stubs, a file of speed info magazines and a book of spells of a Siberian healer torn into pages. In short, the deceased turned out to be a local anonymous exhibitionist, who occasionally hung out in this building. Either he had a heart attack, or he somehow increased his high, that he couldn't cope and died during his favorite activity. The most that happened was when I went with a classmate in grade 6 to climb a local abandoned building once again, and we found a table covered with film in a large room on one of its floors. Who knows how and why they dragged it there. In general, all this bullshit with another sinister presence is a figment of fantasy. Recently with a friend we climbed into the basement of some bullshit to steal Soviet boards from TVs stacked in a pile. As a result, when we went on to look for treasures that we didn't see last time, he heard some rustling in one of the rooms and we quickly left. Although we were both physically normal and I also had a knife with me, if I hadn't forgotten to take a flashlight we would have even shown it. There. On the outskirts of the city there was an abandoned poultry farm, apparently. I ran into some dogs there, but they were far away and I ran away as soon as they started barking at me. In one of the big pens, where there were a shitload of feathers, for some reason there was a goat's leg hanging, as if they were butchering a carcass there. But who the hell knows where a goat came from on a farm like that? The locals had no reason to drag it there. Well, I didn't find any remains except for the hanging leg itself. I also once wandered around an abandoned underground tunnel at night, scribbling anonymous was here on such and such a date. I heard something dripping to my left in the tunnel. I checked, nothing, it didn't even seem to be raining then. As far as I remember, I also stood to the right of the sound source, then it was also dripping, although there was no water. It doesn't seem particularly creepy now, but it's strange. But I haven't encountered any fucking creepiness, maybe it's for the best. I'll write my own. I wouldn't say mystical or terrifying, but I was really scared about it. Once my friends and I gathered at a 10-story frozen building. It was about 11 p.m, it was dark and creepy, it was as if someone was looking at me from the windows, from the darkness itself. The building is not small, 3 buildings, the windows are empty, as are the rooms, there were 3 entrances, all facing some kind of parking lot. We decided to go into the first building. At first it was a bit scary, every 5 seconds we stopped, listened to the sounds. You never know who walks around at such a time, they could be assholes, or they could be crazy. Somewhere on the 5th floor everyone's mood improved, they weren't particularly quiet anymore, they laughed, joked, scared each other. On the 10th floor there was already an entrance to the attic. Well, we climbed in there, it was fucking scary already, a large room with different rooms, no windows, only a centimeter by a centimeter in some rooms. The moon did not shine that night, and there was no wind at all, only the 4 of us made sounds. Well, we slowly walked to the second building, laughing again, but suddenly we hear footsteps right behind the wall. At that moment all the lights were turned off and the foundation for the future brick factory was already laid. Since behind the wall was the same room we were in, it was easy to get there, take 4 steps forward and then turn the corner. Suddenly the steps quickened. There was no light at all, pitch darkness. At that moment, everyone grabbed their flashlights, turned them on and started running away from there. I've never run so fast in my life and I've never been so close to death in my life. The funny thing is that there were no railings on the stairs, just an elevator shaft that stretched from the first floor to the last. That is, one wrong step and I would have ended up on the first floor in a few seconds. But we were lucky and ran away, no one fell or even got hurt. Who it was at night alone in the attic without light, one can only guess, although it was obvious that he was alone. All the same, everyone laid bricks and ran away as quickly as possible. You never know who, they stupidly didn't take weapons with them, and they didn't really expect to meet anyone. That's the story that turned out. It happened in Novosibirsk. At that time, I was a LVL 11 asshole, my buddy Sanya was with me, he was 12 then. In 2008 or so, not far from the zoo there were barracks, settled, all the bullshit. We went there in the evening in winter, at about 7 o'clock. We crawled, stole a bunch of cool stuff, from some dolls to cassettes with BDSM porn, if you believe the title. At one point, I went to take a piss and heard Sanya screaming. I put my dick away, ran to him, a homeless guy, who was covered in snow, grabbed him by the leg. Out of fear, I threw some stone or brick at him, then we ran away. I hit him in the temple and I think maybe I killed him then. There was no news, but it's not surprising. Who the hell knows, in short. There was an abandoned place on the outskirts of our neighborhood, a huge building, even just walking there was fucking awesome. During the day, the guys and I weren't afraid there, especially in a crowd, but after dark, no way. There was no mist there, we made up all the stories ourselves to scare the girls and each other. The years flew by, I grew up, my friends dispersed, I started going there alone to drink, instead of the forest belt. One such moment I decided to go there at night, to test the strength of my ass. I went up to the second floor, to the very back, and quickly regretted it. The atmosphere there was so creepy that you could cut it into slices with a knife. All the stories, all the fears immediately came to mind. I wound myself up to such a frenzy that it seemed like a dream. Only a moron could voluntarily go for it. But leaving was not an option. The stairs were at the other end of the building, behind a labyrinth of black corridors, and the stairs themselves, like a descent into hell. And at that moment, when I was already thinking that even one sound would make my heart stop, I fired as at the other end of the huge room, a person came out of the doorway and calmly walked into the corner opposite me. Although my eyes had already gotten used to the darkness, it was difficult to make out the details, but for some reason I was inclined to think that it was a woman. She stopped there and stupidly stood there, doing nothing, partially merging with the wall. To my surprise, some self-control appeared in me, and I snuck out of there through the dark areas and fucked off without even making a noise. I was shaking at home until the morning. I do not advise anyone whose psyche is not ready to go for such experiments. And the place there is really unhealthy, you can't explain why, but absolutely everyone has always felt it. There are such abandoned places where you can even spend the night, they are so cozy, and there are those that you don't even want to remember at night. As Stephen King said, this room is inhabited by absolute evil. Although there are no manifestations, it would seem. I'll come from afar. I generally like to wander around the outskirts of my Perdivo, look for new places where I haven't been, and just take a walk. On one such trip about 10 years ago, I was carried to the other side of the local forest. There were such impassable wildernesses there that I already regretted that I wandered there. Apparently, no human foot had ever set foot there. So it seemed to me. And so, trying to find at least some kind of road, I came to a rusty fence, behind which was a huge abandoned field, and behind it some buildings. Summer twilight was already approaching, but I still decided to look around there. Apparently, this used to be some kind of stud farm, with several hangars, and half a meter of dried manure on the floor. Apparently, this office closed down before I was born. I was about to leave, when I saw a house behind the bushes, and went to have a look. An ordinary lamp house, it would seem, one floor, tiles, everything. But it looked like it had been smashed to pieces with buckshot. There were gunshot marks all over the walls, chipped plaster, everything was covered in scratches. The windows were also broken, and the bars on the windows were literally gnawed out, almost tied into knots, as if they had been torn with some kind of pliers. The door was knocked down and leaning against the wall next to the entrance. There were no personal belongings inside, except for a stove, a chair, and a table. On the table was some kind of Soviet newspaper and a full bottle of lemonade. I didn't dare drink it. When I left the house, I noticed that there were some inscriptions on the knocked-out door. On the side facing the wall, I turned the door around and was dumbfounded. The entire door was covered in black marker, quite freshly. There were a lot of inscriptions, but they were all roughly of the following nature: "Guys, I beg you, let's come to an agreement. Come on, guys, be human. Guys, let's talk like men. Why act rashly? Here's my number." And the door was all chopped up with an axe. It was already getting dark, and of course I hurried to get out. While I was walking along the dirt road that runs along the field, a deep voice of a man came from the forest, like, "Hey, fuck." Oh. Of course I was shitting myself, but life has taught me not to run anywhere without knowing where the threat is coming from, so I immediately jumped into the nettles and began to look around. The scream was repeated from the edge of the forest. I looked where the voice was coming from, and regretted that I had come here. About 6 lanterns were coming towards me from the darkness of the forest. I even heard them talking to each other, and from time to time they shouted at me. They were walking quite purposefully, as if they were going to kill. Fortunately, there were a lot of thickets there, and I mostly crawled on all fours and got out of there like a bullet. I have no idea the history of this place, what happened there and why. None of my friends even know about the existence of these buildings. I never went there again. Judging by Google Maps, there is little left there. Either it is overgrown, or it has fallen apart, or it has been torn down. Once in the forest, when I was 12 or 13, my friends and I took a fancy to a barn that stood on the land of a long-abandoned, dilapidated house. Once upon a time, an alcoholic lived there. He died of a hangover, lay there for several days and was gnawed by rats. The neighbors did not bury him then. The house itself burned down afterwards. All that was left of it was a pile of charred logs. Even the stove was dragged away for bricks. The house stood on the outskirts of the village, and the barn was completely far from anything, just an ordinary barn on the edge of a vacant lot, which had once been a vegetable garden. We liked it for its solitude. We equipped it with a table, seats, well, everything as usual, a place to hang out. And visited there periodically, messing around. The barn was small, but with a huge high attic. The entrance was from the inside, using a regular step ladder. Apparently, the floors had started to rot, so someone had screwed a huge beam into the middle of the first floor as a support. And so, one summer day, it was August, hot weather, and my friend and I stumbled into this little shed, looking for a place to escape the midday heat. We were sitting, drinking lemonade, playing cards, when suddenly we heard someone walking around. We fell silent, listened. It seemed like nothing. But after a while we heard the rustling of the grass again, clearly. Okay, who knows who was walking? We looked through the cracks in the walls, no one. Someone was shuffling their feet again. I thought the kids were joking and went out to take a look. No one, there was no vegetation around, only apple trees a little further away, and gooseberry bushes, low and dense. You can't hide. As soon as I go inside, this sound of walking happens again. Not scary at all, midday, a populated area nearby, lots of kids, you never know who's playing scout and watching us. Having shared our thoughts with a friend, we decided to quietly climb into the attic and hide there, watching who would come in with the idea of catching the brat. For some reason I was sure it was a small, evil village kid. Well, who else would do such shit at midday on a weekday and give him a good beating? We climbed in, sat like owls, shooting through cracks. It was hard to see, but if there was any movement below, we would have heard and seen a walking shadow. Nothing. After a while, we heard footsteps shuffling on the grass again. Here it is, I thought, and was already in anticipation of jumping down and giving him a training beating, but no, everything went quiet again. A few seconds of silence passed, when suddenly, someone fucking started chopping the timber, hitting it so steadily that the whole attic shook. A few blows, about 5 of them. My friend and I were looking at each other in shock at this point, and everything fell down. I came to in a few seconds, lying in a pile of boards, dust, and pieces of a rotten log that held the flooring in the middle. Luckily, no one was hurt. We got off with bruises and dirty clothes. In shock, we run out into the street, no one. The area is visible for about 30 meters, no one would have managed to get out of sight in those 10 seconds. We go around the shed, no one. We look around, again no one. We look at each other again, equally shocked, and get the fuck out of there. We didn't hang out there anymore. I came by from time to time, and only that area was slowly overgrown with fucking maple. I don't know what it was, either a high-level ninja with an axe, who for some reason decided to screw us over, or I don't even know what. It couldn't break itself. We checked the support several times, everything held up well, it easily supported 3 people. And we clearly felt how everything shook from the blows. I didn't encounter any more creepiness in abandoned buildings. Although I climbed around abandoned factories, and houses, and unfinished buildings, and even lived one summer in the building of an abandoned pioneer camp. The maximum is homeless people, shit, and school children in search of thrills. Reminded me of a time when some guys and I climbed into an abandoned house, were crawling around, poking around, looking for something to loot. Suddenly one of the guys yells at Handa, and we all instinctively fly into the attic through a hole in the ceiling. We shoot through the cracks into the street, and there near the house a military van stops. A crowd of soldiers in masks and with machine guns jumps out and starts turning the whole house upside down looking for us. We even heard them talking, like, "How many of them are there?" "5. They're somewhere around here, Comrade Major. Look for them, Siriaga, they couldn't have gone far." If at that moment someone had stuck a titanium crowbar up my ass, I would have bitten it down to a mirror-like edge. Luckily, they weren't smart enough to look in the attic, and they left. The next day, someone burned the house to the ground. There was nothing suspicious in the hut itself. Judging by the layer of dust a finger thick, no one had been there for about 100 years before us. Besides the sound of footsteps on brick chips in an old store that my friend and I were dismantling for bricks when suddenly it got dark and started raining in broad daylight, there is another mysterious object that haunts me. It was far away in the steppe of the Jezkazgan region, where I was an engineer building an embankment for a railway. It was a wild steppe where a trapezoid embankment for the future railway was simply being built according to the project. And so, in order to inspect the area, my friend and I went towards some old dilapidated building. Along the way, we came across long abandoned cemeteries. They were quite small. By eye, there were about 10 graves. As I thought then, they were specifically Muslim. There were no crosses or monuments. Just sunken graves and some kind of cutting remains. But that's not what I'm talking about. Just a remark about forgotten burials. We walked on and the abandoned places became more distinct. When we walked 5 to 6 kilometers we saw post-Soviet destroyed objects. What were they doing in the distant steppe? Coming closer it was clear that this was not a small object, a large floor went underground and there used to be 2 or more floors up. Oh well, we thought. We didn't want to climb and look down the floor. We just looked around at the vastness and this once object and already wanted to go back. As we noticed a hillock next to these ruins. Such a strange hillock, but what was suspicious was that hidden bricks and concrete were visible from part of it. When we climbed onto it, there was a hatch from above. I don't remember if there was a lid or if it closed. But it was open. Looking down it was scary. There was no bottom below. It was unclear how to get out of there. What was inside was unknown. But since there were 2 of us, we chickened out to reveal the secret of history. We shrugged our shoulders and returned to the containers where our work camp was located. Several years later I think, what could it have been? What is the purpose of this? Could this be a camouflaged object? Maybe it was a storage structure like a refrigerator in Soviet times? It is unknown how far the structure went down. From the outside it looks like an ordinary hill near the ruins of a Soviet building in the middle of the steppe far from settlements. I have not found any information on the internet about what it could be. It would be scary to jump into this hatch and stay there. I've been climbing around factories and homeless shelters since I was 14 and generally having fun. So one time I went on a reconnaissance mission, a bag, a rope, a knife, a crowbar, a mask, not many tools, well it was just reconnaissance. So I find a building, carefully jump over the fence, look around, it seems like no one is there, the door is open, I take out a knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other and go to explore. I hear barely distinguishable steps on the second floor, well I thought it was water dripping from the roof. So I start exploring, sit with my back to the door and look at old magazines, when suddenly someone grabs my pecho with a strong grip and shouts in my ear, "What are you doing here, you little scum?" And he holds me tightly, so tightly that I thought he was going to break my shoulder, but he didn't see what I had in my free hand and I patted his hand. My hand unclenched from the pain and I ran home without looking back, and the homeless man followed me with the screams of a possessed deer. I never went there again and was afraid that he would suddenly kill me when he saw me. Not exactly an abandoned place but something like that. There is a garage cooperative in the city bordering an old unused, practically abandoned cemetery. During the time of the Shkalkat I would periodically walk there, and one day near the tank there was an IS-303 radio without a network trans, already broken down by a local alcoholic, so I thought why should the remains of a grandfatherly device go to waste, it will be used for spare parts. The tank is right on the border of the cemetery and garages, a footpath runs through the cemetery. I pick up the remains, and then literally out of nowhere a guy comes out from behind, walks straight at me and yells phrases like puppy or goldfinch and all sorts of obscenities. I ran into the forest to the cemetery territory, he ran after me, fortunately he got away. I don't know what he wanted. For a long time in Železnodorожny, now Balashikot, there was an unfinished bank. I used to go there many times when the local abandoned hospital was torn down, and I fucked and went shooting. In short, I lived there. So, one winter I went there to feel nostalgic, and discovered that the windows overlooking the kindergarten were boarded up, and there were kids playing snowballs there. So I decided to troll them with phantom snowballs. Anyway, somewhere around the 10th snowball the punks finally noticed me. At first it was one punk, who they had already started to consider an inventor, because I quickly hid behind the windowsill, but a couple of minutes later I showed up to the second one. Soon all the kids were looking at the bank windows and trying to show something to the teachers. The chicks looked back a couple of times of course, but they forgot about it, so a little later I even lit a candle in the window. I was crazy about candles at the time and thought how cool it would be to pray somewhere in random places. Anyway, I scared people then, but ran away quickly, before the true believers were called. Actually, the story itself is not creepy at all, if you don't take into account that the author is a fucking nutcase, judging by everything, but the creepiness is in something else, anon. In the fact that with my fucking experiment I literally confirmed the piss-soaked movie cliché about children noticing a fuck first, and adults, as always, don't give a shit. So anon, if some asshole ever tells you that he saw some bullshit, you better burn some calories and go and check, because some child fucker could have been sitting in the jar instead of me. I'm attaching the coordinates of the place. I'll talk to the pasta. A friend's father works as a communications engineer, develops projects for city water supply systems and so on. What you, anon, saw then is a reservoir, a pit is dug, communications are brought in, ventilation is done so that gases do not accumulate. According to standards it is designed for operation for a third of a century, and during all this time no maintenance is provided. They use it, and when the term is over, they fence it off and forget about it. That's why there are no stairs inside. According to the stories of a friend's father, this thing is fucking dangerous, since the supports in the hill rot through and anyone who climbs risks going to the depths. There is no connection from below. I remind you, there are no stairs, and therefore the unfortunate is doomed to flounder there until exhaustion, until he drowns. If you see such hills, go around. Most are not guarded in any way, and therefore it is very easy to wander in thoughtfulness. Somehow in my bullshit I got interested in this whole stalker digger theme and decided to climb into some bunker myself. It was in Železnodorожny and we didn't have any bunkers, only a huge abandoned hospital, so I armed myself with the internet and on Google Maps and Wikipedia I found some abandoned bunkers on the territory of an abandoned military unit in a neighboring former military town. So, having gathered a squad of buddies, in the harsh winter we took the electric train to that town and went towards the military unit. The first thing I need to say is that it wasn't abandoned at all, at least there was a checkpoint and it was guarded by a soldier, and we had to go around through the forest. It was fucking cold and we walked through snowdrifts, almost fell into some river hidden by snow. As a result, having reached the bunkers, we began to examine them. The first two were relatively empty and there was nothing there except rusty pieces of iron. But the last one turned out to be really fucking creepy. The first thing that caught our attention was a cross standing next to some box. We opened the box and found some kind of package in it, and inside the package something like underwear that had turned into ice. In addition, in one of the corridors of the bunker there was a barrier tape, like a police tape, and at the end of this corridor there was some kind of crap wrapped in a blanket, very similar to the corpse of a homeless person. Having made a loud noise, we hurried back to the station, where we waited for the elk for about an hour. That day I almost froze my finger. I didn't feel it for several hours. I'll tell you my story. It's not very paranormal, but pretty creepy. It was late at night. The three of us were walking and found an abandoned building. An abandoned building is an abandoned building, a 3-story house that was completely smashed, with everything except the walls and the toilet taken out, a huge amount of broken glass around the perimeter, especially by the front staircase, a homeless person's den. Somehow we got past the glass and walked around the top floor. The view from there wasn't the worst, and we also found a black cat there. Anyway, we stayed there for about 10 minutes, behaving quietly. Suddenly, right on the stairs at the other end of the floor from us, a guy appeared. He was middle-aged, normally dressed and sober, and didn't look like a homeless person at all. He aggressively asked what we were doing there and headed in our direction, adding, "Well, what, should we play tag?" We obviously didn't want to play tag, so we started running. We came across a second staircase, which we ran down, but on the first floor we got trapped. There was no exit, but there was a plasterboard wall, which we easily smashed, though I scratched my leg, and kicked the shit out of there. I still can't figure out why the fuck someone needed to climb through broken glass to the 3rd floor of an unguarded abandoned building at 3 in the morning and chase away the assholes from there. I was walking around an abandoned panel house. I have been climbing around the shards for over 9 years and have never seen anything like this. My friends and I climbed to the 5th floor where the apartment was. We bought some tasty things there, energy drink chips. We turned on the music and started chatting. And suddenly there was a knock at the door. We all got scared and barricaded the door. We called another friend to go and investigate. According to him, he was already approaching the entrance and a brick almost fell on him from the 5th floor. After that, we finally got out. It was probably a maniac, since a girl was killed in this place and no organs were found. Abandoned buildings are not comfortable places by default, except for local summer cottages equipped as places to sleep. I live in DS2, next to my previous place of residence. During my school years there were 2 abandoned buildings, a hospital and a cinema. The hospital was a cult place, huge crowds of teenagers hung out there, students from the nearest dorm and other riffraff, drug addicts, alcoholics. That's why there was always a walk-through yard there, so we went there in the evening, when due to the depressing atmosphere of this place, only a couple of lost souls remained. The hospital was unfinished, another story with the idea of construction that fell on the 90s, so there was nothing to do there, except scare the homeless on the top floors. But the cinema was juicier. It was extremely difficult to get there, since the building was a gray 4-story coffin, you can't call it anything else, and the windows of the 1st floor were about 2.5 to 3 m from the ground. The first attempt to get in there with friends was a trip to the basement. We vainly thought that it was possible to get up through some kind of hatch, but after walking along the black corridors with mountains of garbage and rags, we retreated. The next time we found a window on the corner of the building, which we could climb into, because the others were so small that it was unlikely that a head could get through. Having dragged a board from the nearest garbage dump and leaned it on the window, we made a kind of ladder, finally getting inside. The cinema itself was a huge hall with huge glass chandeliers, under which it was stupidly scary to walk, since due to the draft from the broken panoramic windows near the ceiling they swayed extremely convincingly. From this hall there were 2 actual cinema halls, rows of chairs and huge screens made of fabric, which was both torn and scorched. Of course, there were no windows and it was pitch black, and our idiot flashlights on our phones illuminated the maximum distance of an outstretched arm. In one of the cinema halls, there was an iron staircase behind the screen leading to a platform above the hall, made of the same iron. We decided to climb up there, ignoring our sense of self-preservation, but we stopped at the end of the staircase, and one friend decided to walk along this platform. This thing immediately creaked and cracked. Even in the light of the phone you could see the stunned face of the daredevil friend. By a lucky chance he was standing at the railing of the edge of the platform and miraculously managed to grab onto it when the huge metal sheet under his feet flew down. My friend climbed up the railing onto the stairs and we went down in shock. There were also, as I understand it, technical rooms above the halls, one of which caught our attention. Iron springs were welded to the floor of the room, and concrete slabs were attached to them. It all looked like a trampoline, and, of course, we went jumping on it. While we were jumping on these slabs like crazy, the room shook from the roar. Then we came across some kind of den, a homeless shelter, a bunch of mattresses, pillows, personal belongings, but the owners themselves were not there. We decided not to tempt fate. We skipped this rookery of cats and climbed out to the roof through the top floor. There was nothing remarkable there. The most you could do was climb onto the sign of this movie theater, which we did, shitting ourselves about 10 times from the rusting structures. Later, someone smashed the door from the street to one of the movie theaters, and getting into the building was no longer difficult, but the entire audience of the abandoned hospital was in no hurry to go there, so sometimes only we climbed for fun. There were a lot of movie paraphernalia left here, especially reels of film. I even took one as a souvenir. There was a film about some kind of race, but my mother threw all this stuff out with the argument the energy of an abandoned place. It felt like it was very interesting to walk there, but because of the constant fires it was fucking dirty. Eventually they set another arson there, and after that teenagers climbed into the cinema, under whom the second floor collapsed, and they died or were hospitalized. I don't remember anymore. Well, and they put security at the cinema, so it was no longer possible to get in. And it was boring. My list of abandoned places already included places outside the city, but more on that another time. To say that despite all the fun, climbing there was scary, is an understatement. In addition to the fear that this building would collapse like a house of cards with you in the dark corridors of the second to third floors, it was super uncomfortable. Something was always rustling, dripping, grinding. Of course there was a draft, etc. But for an abandoned place such an ambient creates an atmosphere na 10/10. It was about 10 years ago. Now I don't live in this area anymore, but recently there were some things going on here and I was driving past. The hospital was demolished and a residential complex was built, but it looks like they decided to reconstruct the movie theater, though it looks kind of sluggish. I have one frame from the film from there, which I managed to save from my mother. If I find it in a pile of junk, I'll throw it here. Something was always rustling, dripping, creaking. Of course there was a draft, etc. But for an abandoned building such ambient creates an atmosphere not 10/10. It was about 10 years ago. Now I don't live in this area anymore, but recently there were some things going on here and I was driving past. The hospital was demolished and a residential complex was built, but they decided to reconstruct the movie theater, though it looks kind of sluggish. I have one frame from the film from there left, which I managed to save from my mother. If I find it in a pile of junk, I'll throw it here. Something was always rustling, dripping, creaking. Of course there was a draft, etc. But for an abandoned building such ambient creates an atmosphere not 10/10. It was about 10 years ago. Now I don't live in this area anymore, but recently there were some things going on here and I was driving past. The hospital was demolished and a residential complex was built, but they decided to reconstruct the movie theater, though it looks kind of sluggish. I have one frame from the film from there left, which I managed to save from my mother. If I find it in a pile of junk, I'll throw it here. It was in the year 17, I was 14 and we decided with the guys to go to an abandoned vocational school. There were 2 more abandoned dorms there. And we decided to go there for one simple reason. A few months before that, a fucking mess happened there. We had a maniac in Novosibirsk. Whoever lived in the Kalininsky district, maybe he knows, so he and his friends caught some guy and decided to fuck him up. They took him to this abandoned place, injected him with syringes with some kind of shit and he was paralyzed. They fucked his head off with either a grinder or a regular saw, I don't remember anymore, and filmed it all on video. It then circulated on the internet for several months, but then this guy was caught and the video disappeared. So, in the cafeteria building there was a small basement and they scared us all that there was a piano there and it played by itself, but naturally we just laughed at this story. We decided to go down. We were all fucking pissed. It was dark. We go down and start to hear some distant sounds. We don't understand what it is and we go further and then the fucking sound of keys starts to play. Well, we immediately ran away from there and never came back. I don't know, of course, maybe there really is a piano there and it was just some homeless person who decided to play it, but it's stupid to write it off to a child's imagination, since he was no longer old enough to hear something like that. By the way, this abandoned building is still standing and they are not doing anything with it. If I find photos, I'll post them below. I also remembered a story, but I was older. Again, with nothing better to do, we went for a walk at night, went into some bad area and saw an abandoned building. Honestly, I don't know what kind of building it was, what was planned there, etc., but it was about 4 stories high and all the windows were in grates. We walked around it and found a hole in the grating, through which you can crawl, if you try. We decided to climb into it, since there was nothing to do anyway. It's boring at night, nothing happens. There were 5 of us, 4 of us crawled through the grating, and 1 stayed outside, to watch for trouble. We walked along it for about 15 minutes, absolutely nothing happened, there weren't even any sounds. We realized that there was nothing to catch here and were about to leave, but then the following happens. There are about 7 meters left to go to that very grate, just straight ahead. I was walking second to last. We were walking, barking with all sorts of bullshit, and my buddy was walking behind me. I knew he was coming because I heard him laughing, but then he decides to turn right and go through some room and come out about 2 meters from the grate. We walk on and then a stone flies past my head. I say to my buddy in a rage something like, "Fuck, are you stupid or something?" But what if I had hit him in the back of the head and then he appears in front of me? That is, he couldn't throw anything because he was behind the wall. 3 seconds of complete incomprehension of what just happened and I run to that grate. It was harder to get out on the wig. I tore off all my ribs and t-shirt. After standing on the street for a while, having come to our senses, we decided to go around this abandoned building and look out the windows. There's no one there. But after about 7 minutes we see a silhouette on the top floor, who seems to be squatting and looking out of the window, and as soon as he realizes that he was burned, he suddenly drops even lower. Over time we forgot about this situation, but what the fuck was that? Oh, there's a story. When we were little kids, we went to the town of Lykanodoliovo. In short, there was an abandoned construction site, a health resort, I think. Everyone called the place different names: red construction site, mansion, don't go there are drug addicts there. We called it the Red House. Anyway, one ordinary summer day, we got ready to go there again, arrived and headed straight to it. When we got there, we decided to play hide and seek. I was assigned to be the searcher. I counted from 1 to 30 and went looking. 1 was nearby and was hiding behind the wall on the 2nd floor, and we searched for the 3rd for a long time. In the end he came out himself. he said that in the basement where he was hiding he heard some voices, as if several people were talking about something, but in an incomprehensible language. We didn't believe him, but decided to check. And in truth, voices, we wanted to go further into the basement to see who was talking, but we did not dare, it was very dark. Instead we decided to shout. We were then 14 to 15 years old, and of course we shouted, "Fuck," and began to run away. And here is the most interesting thing, anon. After we shouted, we heard as if a gypsy camp was running in the basement. There were so many legs that we were just in shock. My buddies and I tried to hide behind the trees, and saw how about 10 people ran out of the basement, all in black. As soon as the boys and I saw this picture, we immediately ran away. We heard screams in the distance when we ran away, and tried not to pay attention to them, but these screams were always getting closer to us, then far away from us. In the end, we got lost. Only closer to evening we came to the road to the village, Lesnaya, and there with the help of the residents we found out how to get to the city. After that we didn't go to Red House. Fuck, I want to live. To this day I shudder at the thought of what would have happened if one of these people had caught us. I'll tell you a short story about man-made creepiness. As a teenager and student, I loved to wander around abandoned places, at first just like that, then I started to steal swag. I was especially lucky with the distillery. I got 3 boxes of industrial coolers there, for which moonshiners were ready to kill. And when I was leaving the facility, I came face to face with a young security guard. He was scared of me too, but in the end we parted peacefully, and the distillery was later demolished. But that's not what we're talking about now. We have an abandoned BZHRK, a combat railway missile system. And there are fucking deep shafts with ladders there, into which, according to rumors, in the 90s they dumped toxic waste and other shit from all the surrounding industries. So, I decided to climb down there. It was fucking deep, the ladder was shaking, but I still went down, although my asshole had shrunk to the size of an atom. Further down, I found a corridor with a jammed hermetic door, but it was slightly open. Even on the approach, my throat somehow stung unpleasantly, I started coughing, my eyes started watering. I approached the door, not really wanting to continue the journey, because something was clearly wrong, and the answer was behind the door. There were some barrels lying there, some overturned, and a yellow substance similar to turmeric was pouring out of them. I did not want to check what it was, and I got the hell out of there as quickly as possible, because it became unbearable to breathe. And a week later, an acquaintance noticed that my temples had turned gray. And then asthma developed. In short, I breathed in some poisonous shit, and next time I took a good gas mask. It helped, and behind the door was the most ordinary blind corridor in which these barrels were lying. Later, someone blew up the mines, and then the military returned there, but that was quite recently, in about 20 years. Once I walked around an unfinished school. There were a lot of them then, the buildings were spacious, it was very atmospheric. So, a couple of years later, I decided to take a group of school children and students there for a couple of cans of beer. Imagine my surprise when I saw the windows and entrances tightly boarded up with strong timber. Well, what are these boards to me? I had a small crowbar with me. I thought, I'll open everything now. No such luck. Suddenly a siren was heard howling, and it was squeaking in all sorts of keys. This was scary as hell, because this crap was howling overhead in the night silence. In the end, I found out that the siren reacted to movement. I broke down the window, but there were sensors inside the building as well. It's better for no one to know what it is, a siren howling in an empty concrete building. Literally a sound cannon. Anyway, I was left without beer that day. I liked to ride the electric train as a pizdayuk. I arrived in some half-abandoned village. I saw a creepy-looking house, not residential, but some kind of technical structure like either a substation or a warehouse, who knows. I decided to investigate, maybe there was some swag. I used to like collecting all sorts of electrical crap. I went in there. I saw a door blocked by bricks. I got interested. Fuck, I wish I hadn't gone in there. Behind the door there was a staircase leading to the basement. I go down and then the flashlight caught a terrible picture. A half-rotted corpse of a woman or a girl, naked. Nearby, some rags with brown stains. A bottle of vodka, expired cigarette butts, rotted condoms. He ran away from there like a fucking bullet. Obviously a victim of violence. This was back in the early 00s. The condition of the body had been there for a year or two. Fuck. There was a story, my friend and I were climbing an abandoned building, or rather, it was an unfinished building. The place itself is not interesting, but we were attracted by the view from the top floor, where someone installed a bungee, and the basement. As it turned out later, there was something like a bomb shelter there. Having explored the entire basement, not finding anything interesting except for a fake hand, we heard the sounds of footsteps from the upper floors. By the way, it was already getting dark, which caused a little horror, but with this, interest also increased. We slowly walked to the stairs and began to climb up. And now we are approaching the roof and I see a man covered in branches, in some rags. My friend and I do not understand anything and suddenly a flash. As it turned out later, a couple was holding a creepy photo shoot there. The joke was that we scared them, and they scared us. And so, in all my trips to the abandoned place, nothing interesting happened. Once we hid from some pseudo-sectarians, once we found something like a child's coffin in an abandoned village house, there were also a bunch of candles, some old photographs. That's all, good luck to all.